The war on drugs has been an utter failure.
The war on drugs is an abject failure.
End the war on drugs.
In fact, the war on drugs is a failure, isn't it?
The war on drugs has, by and large, been a failure.
I think the federal war on drugs is a total failure.
Number one, we need to end the drug war.
The war on drugs has been a colossal disaster.
I believe deep down that the war on drugs is one of the most stupidest, most venal, most counterproductive policies almost ever designed in this country and around the world.
There's an old saying from Confucius says the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper names. The war on drugs is not the proper name. It's not a war on drugs. If I get caught with a pound of cocaine, it's not the cocaine that goes to jail. It's not a war on drugs. It's a war on people.
We spent the last 2 years looking at the war on drugs, and we've found that the war on drugs has not worked. For 40 years, every year, things have got worse. And yet, politicians who are actually in power do not seem to have the bravery to do anything about it. Whereas the ex-presidents, who are actually on our commission, all realized that they made a dreadful mistake in not actually addressing this when they were in power.
This war on drugs and the mass incarcerations that have happened pretty much for the last 40 years has just decimated the black male population. It's slavery. It's just slavery through and through, and it's the same fear of the black male that existed back in the 1800s.
This war on drugs, if it had any benefit that I could point to as someone who's open to argument, interested in evidence, I would support its continuation. I can't. It's a failure. We know that, and I don't want to be that guy saying I coulda, woulda, shoulda after I'm out of office.
We have had a mind programming exercise called the War on Drugs for the last 40 years, which has been designed to create an internal enemy in our societies and convince people that there are these evil, wicked groups who are doing these terrible, sinful things, smoking these drugs and doing this and that, and there's a very dark image has been created around it, and people get very upset irrationally about this whole issue. And actually, what's been forgotten in all of this, and for me has become, I regard it as an extremely important issue, is that when the state sends us to prison for essentially exploring our own consciousness, this is a grotesque abuse of human rights. It's a fundamental wrong. If I, as an adult, am not, sovereign over my own consciousness, then I'm absolutely not sovereign over anything. I can't claim any kind of freedom at all. And what has happened over the last 40 or 50 years under the disguise of the war on drugs is that we have been persuaded to hand over the keys of our consciousness to the state. The most precious, the most intimate, the most sapient part of ourselves, the state now has the keys. And furthermore, they've persuaded us that that's in our interests. This is a very dangerous situation.
So we have to dismantle the systems that are in place for putting so many people in prison in the first place. And that, number one, is a drug war. Well, I mean, just go back to the 1920s with alcohol prohibition. That was the other time in our nation's history when homicides were literally through the roof. We had the running gun battles back then. We had the drive-by shootings back then. But when we ended alcohol prohibition, so did the homicide rate go down drastically. Now, with drug prohibition, we brought it back up again. Violent crime, the gangs in our communities fighting each other over market share for the drug trade. Let me ask you a question. What part of our current policies of drug prohibition are working? Do we have less crime, less addiction rates, less disease, less overdose deaths? No. None of it's working. And the only solution to ending the drug war is to end the prohibition of drugs. That means legalization.
How about we actually abide by the principles of freedom and we, at the very least, decriminalize these drugs, but what we should do is legalize these drugs. And all these jobs where people, make money locking people up for doing these things, how about, instead of doing that, you can get a job in the new legal drug industry? How about that? How about instead of, being involved with the National Narcotics Officers Associations, you get a job owning a weed dispensary, and you probably make more money, okay? And at least in that case, you wouldn't be ruining people's lives for absolutely nothing.
I mean, the thing is after Prohibition, it's not like the organized crime gangs went away. They still existed.
Well, they don't exist in the alcohol trade, and most people, criminals respond to market incentives like anyone else. If there's a huge and lucrative industry that you can control in the illegal trade, people will go into it. If it's reclaimed by the legal trade, we don't have to talk theoretically. I went to Switzerland where they've legalized heroin for addicts. You know, where are the heroin dealers in Geneva? They're not there anymore. You know, the people you get your drugs from are doctors and pharmacists. You go to a clinic, not pharmacists, sorry, you go to a clinic and you can use heroin there, they'll give it to you. There are no violent heroin dealers in Geneva anymore because it's in the hands of a legal trade. You know, it's not, the violence is the product of prohibition.